Hello and welcome to the Sunday Lake Algae Control Plan. We're so glad you're taking the time to learn more about options to help improve the health of Sunday Lake. Of course, we would much rather see you in person than have this online presentation, but given the circumstances, we're doing the best we can. And the good news is you get to go through the plan on your own pace in the comfort of your own home. But please do, at the end of the presentation, take the time to provide us your feedback by completing the survey. We're asking for all feedback by June 12th so we can finalize this plan for your community and get it out to you. Thank you. We wanted to start off by introducing ourselves. I'm Marissa Bergdorf with Snohomish County Surface Water Management. If you haven't heard of Surface Water Management, we're the county's utility provider for surface water services. We do things like making sure that the drainage network throughout the county is flowing, including the ditches and culverts. We work to protect the health of our local rivers, lakes, and streams, such as the project we're doing today, but other things as well as salmon recovery and other important habitat things. We also work to reduce road flooding and build projects to do that, and as well as provide flood alerts and support services for river flooding. And other contributors to the plan in the picture here are Jennifer Oden and Katie Ruthenberg, who many of you have corresponded with in the past. Before we launch into the plan, we thought it would be important to first look back and see the reasons why Snohomish County and the community began this algae control plan project. Over the years, Sunday Lake residents have been a big advocate for their lake and have been very concerned about the quality of it, and they've been asking for solutions. So just looking back, starting in 2002 is when the lake community first came to the county and asked for suggestions on what they could do to improve the lake. This continued in 2006 with the Sunday Lake Ecology Planning Group, and again in 2012 with a push to understand if floating islands would be a good option for lake restoration, and finally again in 2015 a plea for help saying that they had seen the great work at Lake Ketchum and were wondering if something for their lake could be done to also restore it. Throughout the years, the community has had three main concerns that have consistently emerged. The first is widespread fragrant water lily, which is an invasive plant that has spread across much of the lake. The second is very low levels of dissolved oxygen in the lake. This negatively affects the fish and other aquatic life and is the reason that Fish and Wildlife has stopped stocking the lake with trout each year. And finally, and the one we're going to be talking about the most today, is excessive growth of algae. This can produce unsightly scums that reduce recreation and can also be toxic. Sunday Lake can sometimes experience what's called toxic algae blooms. It looks like green or blue paint floating on the surface as seen in the pictures below. Toxic algae just refers to a certain type of algae called cyanobacteria. These algae are common to all of our area lakes, but sometimes they can grow excessively and form these blooms. And sometimes there can be toxins associated with the scums. The only way to tell if these algae blooms are harmful is to test for toxins. And from 2010 to 2012, we had a rigorous testing program we were able to do at Sunday Lake through a grant program. In that time, we tested for two major toxins. The first was microcystin, which is a toxin that affects the liver. And the second was anatoxin, which is a neurotoxin, meaning it affects the nervous system. In that time, we found very low levels of anatoxin in 2010 and 2011. The recreational guideline set by the State Department of Health is 1 microgram per liter, and it was never above that. But in 2011, we found that microcystin was in high levels and exceeded the recreational guideline of 8 micrograms per liter. This is when citizens started to get really concerned about the health of their lake, in particular because of the health threat that the toxic algae posed. In 2013, that program ended, and we've seen several blooms and incidences of algae there. However, we have had no toxin testing results to show that toxins have been present. Before we proceed, I just wanted to take a minute to pause and talk about what to do if you see a toxic algae bloom at Sunday Lake. So first of all, you want to report the bloom. So if you see something that looks like blue or green paint floating on the surface, or maybe just chunks of bright blue or bright green algae, please report the bloom. Call us, email us, let us know so that we can come out, take a sample, and have it tested for toxins. In addition, if we do find toxins, we'll be posting the community site and the public access site with a warning sign, as well as sending out a communication to lake residents. You can sign up for those toxic algae alerts on our website or by giving us a call. And then you should finally follow the guidance of toxic algae blooms on this warning sign by not swimming or water skiing. Well, obviously you're not water skiing in Sunday Lake. Don't drink the lake water. Keep your pets and livestock away. Dogs like the taste of this algae, so it's particularly important to not let them drink the water. And then if you're fishing, clean fish well and discard the guts, and avoid areas of scum. This is where the toxins accumulate. If it's not posted and you see these blooms, the best advice is to, when in doubt, stay out. The next question people often ask is, why is this happening? And we're looking at the problems of low dissolved oxygen and excessive plant and algae growth. There's one underlying cause, which is excessive phosphorus pollution. Phosphorus is a key nutrient in freshwater lakes, but it's usually only found in very small amounts. Just a tiny bit can go a long way. Estimates are that 1 ounce of phosphorus can grow up to 31 pounds of algae. As shown in the picture on the right here, you can see the green side of the lake has been fed and fertilized with phosphorus, and the other side of the lake has not. In addition to concerns, the community has mostly wanted to know, what can we do about these problems? And in response, Snohomish County has provided lake health monitoring through our volunteer lake monitoring program to try and track down and figure out the current conditions of Sunday Lake health. Next, we provided toxic algae testing and notification. This is a free program where residents can report blooms, and through the state, we have them tested and let residents know if there's a health threat. And lastly, we developed the LakeWise program, which helps prevent phosphorus pollution by giving residents tools that they need to prevent pollution from their properties. But we recognize that additional actions are needed to restore the health at Sunday Lake. But there's never been really funding or ability to take those additional actions. But in 2017, the Freshwater Algae Control Grant Program has grants available to help fund plans to restore lakes by doing algae management plans or algae control. In conjunction with the community, we applied for and successfully obtained a grant to develop an algae control plan for both Sunday Lake and Lake Loma, which is a little further south of Sunday Lake. And this is how we ended up developing this algae control plan for the lake community. We want to clarify now that this plan will not address the fragrant water lily issue at the lake. Snohomish County is able to provide technical assistance on this and has worked with the community over the years on ideas of how to control fragrant water lily. We cannot provide financial support though, as this is a widespread problem at many of our area lakes and there simply isn't enough funding to go around. However, residents at Sunday Lake are actively working on this issue, and if you're interested in finding out more, reach out to your neighbors or to the Sunday Lake community groups that are working on this issue. So as we start to look at the algae control plan today, there are going to be 3 parts that we will focus on. So the first part is going to be understanding the problem. So this is where we take a look back and review the lake health. So this is all the historical information about the lake. And then we also completed, as part of the grant project, a 1-year study to identify and quantify all of the pollution sources into and out of the lake. And we're especially focused on phosphorus. The second part is to find the best solution. So once we have that information, it's critical to understanding what's happening in the lake. We can then evaluate what solutions are. So we looked at several restoration options, and from using the best available science and knowledge at hand, we selected what was the best solution that we felt for the lake and estimated costs or detailed costs for those solutions. And then lastly is really, we put forth recommendations, but the step 3 or part 3 is to really choose a path forward. And this is something that the lake community will have to be involved in, and that's why we really need your feedback on this plan. And you as a community will have to decide if you want to move forward and what those next steps might be based on what we could find as the best solutions. So before we get started into that part 1 of understanding the problem, I just wanted to pause and say thank you to all of those lake volunteers out there. Over the years, we've had volunteers since 1992, and they've been instrumental in collecting all this information so that we can make these good decisions for the lake today. So thank you. Okay, so in terms of understanding the problem, there are 5 general areas that we look at in terms of lake health, including temperature and oxygen of the water, water clarity, which is how far down into the water you can see, phosphorus, algae, and the shoreline health. So each of these, we can show health. We have them broken down into 4 different categories of excellent, good, fair, and poor. So first, we want to make a point that within those categories, there's a lot of variation naturally. So not all lakes would be expected to be in excellent condition for all those parameters. Instead, some lakes like Lake Rossiter or Lake Stevens, a lot of the really big lakes are going to have a lot of excellent conditions, where smaller lakes similar to Sunday Lake would have more fair conditions. And those are all fine. There's nothing wrong with necessarily having a fair condition. What we get concerned about is when there's a poor condition. This indicates a problem. And something that probably indicates the lakes need some sort of restoration. We also are concerned if problems are changing fast. So if you have an excellent lake that in just a matter of a couple decades is transitioning to good in a category, in terms of lake time, that's very fast. We would expect these changes to occur over hundreds and hundreds of years rather than 10 or 20 years. So the first 2 parameters we look at for lake health are lake temperature and oxygen, and we clump these together because they're very closely related. So let's start off by looking at temperature. So if you went out to Sunday Lake in the middle of the winter, you'd find that the temperature at the top of the lake and the bottom of the lake are identical. The lake is really well mixed and everything's pretty much the same. But as it becomes warmer and warmer, in the summertime, we find that the top of the lake is much warmer than the bottom of the lake. And these temperature differences are so great that there is actually a density difference in the water, and the warm water is much lighter and floats on top of the dense water at the bottom. This creates a condition where the lake no longer mixes. It's called stratification, and we'll find out more about what that happens to oxygen because of that. And you might have experienced this if you've ever been swimming in the lake and you feel like your toes are really cold, but the top of the lake is warm. In the fall, usually after a big windstorm, when the temperatures are getting closer, the lake turns over, and which just means that the temperature difference is we're not so great anymore and the entire lake mixed. So this graph shows the temperature of Sunday Lake throughout the year. And it's a little bit hard to read until you kind of get oriented. So where you see the wavy line at the top, that represents the surface of the lake. On the left-hand side is showing the depth of the surface down to the bottom of the lake, which is about 16 feet deep. So each one of these lines will start with winter. It's the far left line with the little dashes in the middle. Shows the temperature readings that were taken every meter from the top to the bottom of the lake. So what you can see is in the winter, the lake is quite cold at about 38 degrees, and it's the same throughout the entire lake. However, if we jump over to a summer month, so if you look at May, which is the one with the squares, you can see the top of the lake is very warm, represented by the red part of the line. Yet the bottom of the lake stays cold and is down closer to 50 degrees, showing that the lake is already stratified by May, meaning that there's no longer mixing between this warm part of the lake that's at the top and the cold part of the lake at the bottom. The dissolved oxygen in the lake follows a really similar pattern to the temperature in the lake, where you start off in the winter and the lake is fully mixed and it has lots of oxygen as shown by the green color. So the oxygen is replenished from the atmosphere and mixed throughout the lake. Now we can look at dissolved oxygen at Sunday Lake, and this graph is very similar to the temperature one we looked at, with the wavy line at the top representing the surface of the lake, and on the left-hand side, the depth of the lake going from the surface of 0 down to 16 feet. So again, we took oxygen readings every meter. So if you look over to the far right of the graph for the winter readings with the dash, you can see that the lake is well mixed and there's oxygen that's pretty much the same, around 11 milligrams per liter from the top of the lake all the way down to the bottom. It doesn't take long in the spring though for that to change. So if we look to the next line to the left with the squares is May, and this line is showing that there's lots of oxygen represented by the green down to about 7 feet in the water, but below that the oxygen levels drop off to nearly 0 below 10 feet of water. And if you look at June then, where the triangles are, you can see that there's hardly any oxygen even at the lake surface which is down to about 3 or 4 feet, there's 0 oxygen after that, which is a very difficult time for fish when there's so little oxygen available and the surface temperatures are so warm that it can add a lot of stress to those fish. The next measure of lake health that we use is water clarity. And just like it sounds, water clarity is how far down into the water you can see. And we measure that using a black and white disc called a Secchi disc. There are a few things that can affect water clarity. The first is the particles that are in the water. There's 2 types of particles you can have. You can either have sediment that is flowing into the lake when it runs off or rains. And the second particle you can have, which is seen here in this picture, is algae particles. So if you have a lot of algae in the lake, it's going to reduce the water clarity. The last thing that can affect water clarity is water color. In the Pacific Northwest, our lakes are typically darker than many other regions of the country because we have lots of tannins, which it comes from all of the conifers and evergreens in our area. As the water runs off, they pick up that color and we get those brown tea-colored lakes. Now Sunday Lake does have some water color, but it is not as dark as some of the other area lakes, though there will be some influence from that. Here we can see the water clarity at Sunday Lake, and we'll see several of these graphs. And the way to look at those again is at the top we have the wavy line, which represents the water surface. And on the left-hand side is our Secchi measurement. So this one, it starts at 0, and the further down into the water that you can see is a measure of higher water clarity. Over here, in the blue area, each dot represents the annual summer average. So that's how many water clarity readings were taken all summer averaged together. And so this started back in 1991 all the way to 2019. You can see that over time, the water clarity has typically been in the range of poor and fair. There's been a few readings. There's this one reading here in the good range, but generally our water clarity is around 6 feet. There has been a slight decreasing trend, meaning the water clarity has gotten a little bit lower over that time period. So in terms of how we rate that in our poor, fair, and good, excellent rating, water clarity at Sunday Lake is considered poor. We can also compare the water clarity of Sunday Lake to other area lakes to get some perspective. So on these graphs, you will see that all of the area lakes that we monitor are at the top of the graph. On the left-hand side, we again have our Secchi depth reading starting at 0 at the top and increasing or improving in water clarity as you go down. Sunday Lake, you can look to the red arrow to see it, and the dot in the middle there represents the long-term average of Sunday Lake. I should point out that this graph is in meters rather than feet, so 2 meters is about 6 feet for Sunday Lake's long-term average. The line represents the range at Sunday Lake, so this is the top of the line represents the poorest, and the bottom of the line next to the red arrow is the highest water clarity reading that we've had at Sunday Lake. So Sunday Lake has the 9th lowest water clarity in the county. The next health parameter we look at is phosphorus, and we actually look at 2 different phosphorus readings, the first of which is in the upper waters, which is taken at 1 meter. The upper water phosphorus can be thought of as what's happening with current pollution in the lake. Looking at Sunday Lake total phosphorus, we have another similar graph, except in this case, phosphorus is on the left-hand axis here, and it starts from 0 on the upper waters going up to a scale of about 80 micrograms per liter. It's a very tiny amount of phosphorus. As you can see from the graph, most of the annual summer averages, represented by the blue dots, are in the fair and poor ratings. There is a significant decrease in phosphorus in the upper waters over time, which is encouraging, but it's still hovering right here in the fair readings. And last year in 2019, we did have a poor rating. Overall, the conditions at Sunday Lake still show that the water quality rating for phosphorus in the upper waters is poor. We can also compare total phosphorus in the upper waters to other area lakes. This time the lakes are on the bottom axis, And phosphorus is on the left-hand axis, and I just want to point out that this is a logarithmic scale, so there's a 10-fold increase between each of these numbers. You'll see here on the far left that there is the highest lake in the county, which is Ketchum, and this is actually a pre-restoration value, and it has since decreased to down over here. So now Sunday Lake, if you look at the red arrow, is the second highest phosphorus levels in the county and has a rating of poor. The second phosphorus health parameter we look at is in the lower waters. And this is because the lower water phosphorus is a reflection of how much pollution is stored up in the lake sediments. And in order to understand this, we need to look back at our dissolved oxygen graph. So phosphorus is stored in the lake sediments shown here in the bottom. So any phosphorus that runs into the lake is mostly sinks down and sticks in those sediments. Most of the phosphorus will stay in those sediments when there's plenty of oxygen in the water. However, in the summertime, if we recall, these black areas to the left indicate that there's very little oxygen in the water. And at that time, a chemical reaction occurs that allows the phosphorus to be released from the lake sediments and is recycled back into the lake each summer. When looking at phosphorus in the bottom waters, we can use this graph here. One thing to point out is that on the left-hand side, where the phosphorus values are shown, this is much higher than the upper waters. Before, in the upper waters, the maximum value was around 80 micrograms per liter. Now our axis goes to 900 micrograms per liter. As you can see, the phosphorus levels in Sunday Lake are very high and are considered in poor condition in the bottom waters. They're also variable from year to year, which can depend on when the lake stratifies, how warm it is earlier in the spring. And you can also see that there is an increasing trend of phosphorus over time. And this makes sense because as more pollution builds up in the lake over time, you're likely to see it increase, and that's what we're seeing at Sunday Lake. So again, we can compare Sunday Lake to all the other lakes in the county. And right here is Sunday Lake. It is now the highest phosphorus in the county since Ketchum has now been restored and is much lower. And this is a really big concern because this is what we're thinking is happening is a lot of the phosphorus is coming up into the lake each year and being recycled into it. The next measure of health we can look at Sunday Lake is the algae in the water. And first I just want to stress that algae are not necessarily bad things. Algae is a really important piece of the lake ecosystem. Algae are basically tiny plants that photosynthesize, use that sunlight's energy to produce energy, and this is what zooplankton and fish eat, and so are really important. And there's a wide variety of algae that are important to Sunday Lake. So in terms of algae, what we get concerned about, though, is when we have excessive algae growth. And this is something that is fed by that phosphorus that we talked about. And so just to orient you here at Sunday Lake, chlorophyll A is how we measure algae. It's the pigment that algae uses to do photosynthesis, just like plants. And so we can take a measure of that. And we find that in most years, Sunday Lake is usually in the fair or the poor region. However, in 2019, it was an interesting year. It was actually in terms of rated as good in terms of algae, which was quite surprising given how high the phosphorus levels were. So again, chlorophyll A, we don't really see big trends except for the fact that it changes from year to year. This partly is a factor of that we only collect samples once a month, so the algae can change a lot, but it gives us a flavor that generally we're seeing a lot of algae growth in Sunday Lake. And this would be classified as a poor condition in terms of algae at Sunday Lake. So this is our last comparison graph when we look at chlorophyll A at Sunday Lake. So this is Sunday right here, and it is the fourth highest in terms of algae, and it's just right in that cusp of the poor to fair condition. The last piece we can look at for understanding lake health is the health of the lake shoreline. So a healthy lake shoreline has lots of native plants and vegetation along the shoreline. It's especially important that they're deeply rooted plants. And this type of vegetation is important for two reasons. So first, it provides important habitat for things like amphibians and frogs and aquatic insects and other things that the fish rely on to eat. It secondly acts as an important is kind of a sponge and a filter for water coming in. So any pollution that might be flowing into the lake, this type of vegetation on the shoreline can trap it and prevent it from getting in the lake. So if we look at Sunday Lake, the last survey that was done was in 2010, and at that time approximately 55% of the lake shoreline, as noted by those green areas, was in considered a healthy condition, and the other 45% was unhealthy. In most cases, this means that the shoreline vegetation was replaced by lawn. It's a really popular thing for people to do, not really knowing that it could affect lake health. It helps preserve views and other things. But one thing I want to mention is that lake shoreline property owners at Sunday Lake have been really proactive, and we had 6 different shoreline property owners restore their vegetation on the shoreline and maintain that. So if we took the survey again, which should happen this year, we're going to find that another 550 feet of shoreline around the lake is going to be healthier, especially in these areas and including the community club. And so that's really exciting, and thank you to all who did that effort to try and improve the health of the lake. So now if we look at the overall health of the lake, we can put all of these parameters together to get a good picture. So we can start with water clarity. It is quite low and is classified as poor. Phosphorus in the upper and lower waters is also classified as poor, meaning there's high amounts of phosphorus pollution in the lake. And not surprising, that high amount of phosphorus pollution feeds a lot of the algae growth, also indicating it's a poor. The good thing is that the shorelines are in that fair condition and are moving towards actually a good condition. So that's one of the most important things that Sunday Lake has, is a really healthy shoreline habitat. But overall, the lake averages out to be in poor water quality. So everything you've seen up to this point has to do with the water quality history of the lake using the information that volunteers have collected over the last 20 years. But what really defined this study and made it distinct is that we went the next step to identify and quantify the pollution sources. So if you're going to fix a problem, you have to know where it's coming from. And for lakes in general, pollution comes or flows into the lake from its watershed. So lakes can be considered a reflection of the watershed. And watershed is just a term that means the area that flows to the lake. And so in Sunday Lake, this yellow line is all of the area that flows into the lake. So any rain that falls in here will eventually flow through either to Jackson Gulch or directly flow into the lake. So another way to look at the watershed is just a simple graphic to look about where the water comes from. So the most simplest place where water can come from is there's rain. So it can rain directly onto the lake. You can also have water from runoff. So when it rains, it might hit the ground first and then flow across overland and then go into the lake or a stream. You can also have, if it goes into the stream, it can flow in through the stream. This would be Jackson Gulch in the case of Sunday Lake. And you can also have water flowing in through shallow groundwater. And that's just kind of subsurface flow that would also go into the lake. In addition to the water that comes into the lake, pollution is going to come along for the ride. So anytime that you've got runoff or groundwater or other things, it can carry phosphorus into the lake. And lastly, you can also get, we talked about before, how you can get phosphorus in the lake sediments. So over the years, as everything flows into the lake, it can also come up from the lake sediments. And Sunday Lake has another source of phosphorus, and that is waterfowl. So when waterfowl are roosting, especially the swans that stay there overnight, their phosphorus can come from their poop. It's really rich in phosphorus, so anytime you've got big birds pooping in there, you can get lots of phosphorus into the lake. In order to measure this first source of phosphorus, which is the rain directly to the lake, we used a Snohomish County maintained precipitation gauge located at Lake Crabapple, which is about 6 miles south of Sunday Lake. So if you ever wondered how much rain falls in your area per year, this shows that from 2008 to 2018, each blue bar represents the annual total, ranging from 26 inches in 2009 to almost 50 inches in 2012. The 10-year average is 38.2 inches. And so we can take that and multiply it times the average concentration of rain or phosphorus in the rain, and we find that there is approximately 2.1 kilograms of phosphorus per year that comes from the rain. And as you'll see, this is a really pretty small amount for the total annual contribution of phosphorus to the lake. So going back to our sources, we looked at the rain. Now we're going to look at the runoff as a source of phosphorus pollution. As water runs across the landscape, there are two main sources of phosphorus that it can pick up and carry into the lake, and those are poop and dirt. So if we think about poop, some of the main sources are, first of all, animal waste. So animal waste is something a lot of people don't think about as having nutrients or phosphorus pollution, but it is very rich in phosphorus. Similarly, fertilizers are basically synthetic poop that we're putting on our landscapes to grow. The good news is that lawn fertilizers in Washington state no longer contain phosphorus except for new lawns. So that's been reduced somewhat. In terms of dirt, our main sources are if you have bare soils or eroding soils in your yard. Anytime there's water running across it, it can run down either into a ditch or a stream and eventually reach its way into the lake. It also used to be really common to have runoff piped to our lakes directly from things like driveways or homes, which may also carry phosphorus and dirt right into the lake. Now, shorelines aren't a source of pollution themselves, but when shorelines had intact native vegetation, they used to be able to filter out and act like a sponge and clean the water before it got into the lake. When we take that out and we replace it with things like lawn, we lose that ability to clean the water and have increased pollution as a result. So when we think about how we can calculate how much runoff, how much phosphorus is carried on runoff, it's hard to actually go out and measure how much is flowing in from something like animal waste or something. So instead what we do is we take a look at the different types of land uses in the watershed, and based on previous studies we're able to assign a certain amount of phosphorus that would come off of that based on the rain amounts. And so if we look at Sunday Lake, the major land uses here, we have 43% that's in light urban residential. That's that purple area that we see around the lake. There's forested is the next biggest group at 25%. There's also light rural residential, which are these yellow areas in the lake, and pasture. And there's 5% about is the roads themselves, so things like Sunday Lake Road and that sort of thing. When applied against how much phosphorus pollution comes up, we find that our residential areas are contributing about 69% of the phosphorus pollution flowing into the lake from surface runoff. There is some natural pollution that comes from forests that accounts for about 16%. Think about leaf litter or that sort of thing. Streets, there's not very many of them, but they are big potential contributors at 10%, and those pasture lands are at about 5%. In total, we find there's about 64 kilograms per year of phosphorus coming into the lake from surface water runoff. The next thing we're going to be looking at when quantifying our phosphorus sources is our groundwater flowing into the lake. So groundwater is basically what's flowing in through the water table, through the kind of spaces and particles beneath Earth's surface. So when it rains, some of that water goes into the ground and it flows through the groundwater. Septic systems are the main source of phosphorus to groundwater. And the way this happens is that the septic system effluent goes out into the drain field, and it can go down through the soil particles and get into the groundwater. It's particularly high if you have a poorly maintained septic system or if your septic system is failing. In order to estimate the amount of phosphorus coming in from groundwater from septic systems, we did an analysis of all the septic systems in the Sunday Lake watershed, and we found that in total there's about 36 septic systems in the lake shoreline and 263 in the lake watershed. And of those, we broke them up by different types. The ones that are most likely to contribute pollution are the older ones, especially gravity systems that are closer to the lake. And what we find is there's about 15 of these older systems, plus another 10 unknown, which the reasons they can be unknown is they're so old they don't have any records, or it could be brand new ones that haven't been filed yet, but most of these are probably old. There are a lot of old systems around the lake that could be a big problem. In the watershed, they're a little further away, so they might be a little less likely to contribute, but could still be a big problem, and there's also a really high amount of these gravity or potentially older systems. So we found that our estimate is about 9 kilograms of phosphorus per year from these sources. Unfortunately, we didn't have a lot of groundwater data to really fully support this to understand what for sure that groundwater contribution is, but we looked at well logs and other things for when those septic systems are installed, And there is quite a bit of evidence to suggest that groundwater does not play a huge role in Sunday Lake's kind of water budget for the year. But in order to do a price of a full groundwater study, we estimate to be about $150,000. So we decided to kind of go with this simple approach. So there is a lot of uncertainty in this number, but our best guess is about 9 kilograms per year. The next source of phosphorus pollution we'll be looking at is that comes from the lake sediments, which is also called internal loading. To be able to quantify the amount of phosphorus in the lake sediments, we take a sediment core using a piston core sampler as shown in these pictures. So this graph represents the phosphorus levels of the two sediment cores. And I know that these numbers probably don't mean much to you, but this is the total phosphorus on the top, and this is the sediment depth. So it was measured about every 5 centimeters down in the sediment. This was taken in the shallower part of the lake, and it's somewhat expected. It's got lower levels of total phosphorus. This is because kind of the sediments work their way down into the deeper part of the lake, and we often find the highest sediment levels in the deep part of the lake. And there's a big peak here right at 10 centimeters, showing that there was a lot of phosphorus deposition occurring at that time. So it's kind of hard to put these numbers into perspective. So we have some different lakes to compare them to. So first of all, there's Liberty Lake, which is a much larger lake in eastern Washington, and it's got fairly low phosphorus levels and pretty infrequent algae blooms to kind of give you a comparison. So Sunday Lake is quite high. Pulling it closer to other lakes, Wapato Lake and Lake Ketchum are both lakes that have smaller lakes in this region that have in the past had chronically levels of toxic algae and have had blooms much of the year. So they are very kind of high productive lakes. So Sunday Lake is still much higher, at least the deeper profile, than those two lakes. Another lake to compare it to is Lake Loma. And Loma is the only lake that had higher concentrations here at these upper levels. And Loma is very similar to Sunday, though, having somewhat frequent toxic algae blooms, but not as nearly as much as you would expect given these super high levels in the sediment. So one of the reasons is we think about why Sunday Lake might have these high levels of phosphorus. And one of the interesting things that many of you probably already know is that Sunday Lake was home to a logging camp in the early 1900s. And thanks to an interview done by some local residents, they found documentation that there used to be a swimming house and all sorts of other neat information. But one of the things that it mentions is that there was a ton of cedar chafing. So as the logs were stored in the lake, the cedar parts would slough off. And so you had a lot of deposition of this kind of organic matter. So that might be one reason that accounts for that higher level, especially that older spike. And then, as we've already talked about, the pollution keeps flowing in. So as Sunday Lake got developed initially, and there's pollution that came with that, and then it keeps flowing in from a lot of our homes and properties. And of course, then the waterfowl has come in, which we're going to talk about in a second. And so all those things over years end up building up in that lake bottom, causing those really high levels of nutrients in the lake sediments. So the question is we know how much phosphorus is stored up in the sediments, but how much is released? And so we're able to do some calculations to understand what that sediment release rate is based on that year-round monitoring that we did for that entire year. And so what we found is that the amount of phosphorus released is 114 kilograms per year. So that's about twice of what was coming in from runoff each year. So it is a big proportion of the phosphorus from the year. But one thing that's really surprising is that it's much lower than Lake Ketchum, which we've referenced several times in this presentation. So you saw in the previous slide, Sunday Lake had much higher amounts of sediment or of phosphorus in the sediments, but the release rate, how much is actually going into the lake each year, is much lower. It's about a fifth of what was happening at Lake Ketchum. And so that's something that's pretty exciting because it could be a lot worse at Lake Ketchum or at Lake Sunday. So the last source of pollution that we're going to talk about for Sunday Lake is waterfowl. And this one's fairly unique to Sunday Lake given the mass quantities of swans that the lake receives in the summer. So as many of you know, Sunday Lake is home to many waterfowl, including Canada geese and swans, trumpeter swans mostly, as well as ducks and other waterfowl. So in order to effectively understand the amount of phosphorus coming from waterfowl, we had to know how many there were. So I want to give a big shout out to our volunteers, especially Jim Collins, that took a lot of historic readings of swan numbers, as well as Barbara Haas, who gave amazing data counting swans each day. It was really incredible. So a big thank you for that. And what we found is that on average, 320 swans roosted on Sunday Lake from November 1st to March 31st. There was about an average of 21 geese and 51 ducks spent on the lake as well from that same time period. And from our regular volunteer monitors, we found that in the summer period, that about 33 geese and 10 ducks spent each day on the lake. So from that, we were able to do some calculations of figuring out how much a swan poops each day or a goose poops each day, then figuring out how much phosphorus is in that poop and figuring out how much actually gets into the lake, depending on how much time they spend on the lake. So it was a pretty fun calculation. But what we estimated is that in total, waterfowl contributes 350 kilograms per year. And this is an enormous amount of phosphorus coming into the lake. And almost all of that is from November through March, with the swan population of 341 kilograms per year, with the rest of it coming over the summer months. So we've done our best to estimate this, but this is probably the figure that has the greatest amount of uncertainty associated with it. But it gets us in the ballpark of just the sheer quantity of pollution that's coming in through this source. So if we put this all together, we find that the annual phosphorus load to the lake is about 543 kilograms of phosphorus per year. This is a very large amount of phosphorus coming into the lake in comparison to a lot of our other area lakes. And a huge chunk of that, about 64%, is waterfowl. In addition to that, the sediments account for about 21%, and the runoff and groundwater together account for about just over 20% that's remaining. So again, the waterfowl is probably the least certain of these. There's, is an estimate of how much might be coming in. But what this really helps us to do is, if we know each of the sources, it helps us to really develop a plan that's tailored to addressing these individual sources for Sunday Lake. And that's really the goal of what we needed to do to develop an effective plan for the lake. Okay, so this part is now to figure out what the best solutions are for Sunday Lake. And this is the part of the presentation I think many of you are most interested in finding out about what could work for Sunday Lake. So our solutions we're mostly looking at are for algae control, because it is an algae control plan. And there's a few ways that you can control algae. First, you can try and control it directly. There are products out there to try and kill algae, and we'll look at some of those. But most of them have to do with controlling phosphorus. So we'll start by controlling external phosphorus sources or internal phosphorus sources. And external phosphorus sources would be things coming from the waterfowl and the runoff and that sort of thing. And the internal phosphorus sources would be coming from the lake sediments. So the first methods we looked at are things that can directly control algae. So you see a bunch of algae out there, you add something to the lake to try and prevent that algae or kill that algae. The first is algicide. It's just what it sounds. There are different products out there that are developed to be able to apply to the lake that have been approved and permitted to kill algae. The problem with these types of products is that once you apply it and kill the algae die, they decompose, release all the nutrients, and you tend to just get another algae bloom. So it's very cyclical, requires repeated applications, and is more like a Band-Aid approach rather than getting at the real problem. The other things, there are some products that are physical inhibitors, either shading products, or there are also these ultrasonic devices that people have developed to try and disrupt the cellular membrane of algae and kill it. There's been some initial studies done that have found these to be not effective in these large-scale applications. And so these methods were rejected as not good solutions for. The next solutions we looked at are those that could help to control external phosphorus pollution. And the two main sources of external phosphorus pollution are runoff, stormwater runoff, which is pollution mainly from homes in the area. So these are the things that, like pet waste and fertilizers and eroding soils, that are contributing to the pollution. There also is a small amount from groundwater, which is almost exclusively from septic systems. So these are the pieces of the pie that the community has control over of trying to reduce. It is difficult though, because a lot of people don't even realize that things that they may be doing around their homes are contributing to pollution. The problem of pollution from runoff from homes around the lake is not one that's just seen at Sunday Lake, but is a problem common to many of our area lakes. In response, Snohomish County developed the LakeWise program, which is an educational program that helps people know, first of all, learn about and know sources of phosphorus pollution from their properties, and then also equips people with the tools and the technical know-how to try and reduce phosphorus pollution from their property. So many of you already know about the LakeWise program, as we've had a lot of Sunday Lake participation, but for those of you that are new to it, LakeWise is essentially a certification program. And the idea is that landowners can make small changes on your property to prevent pollution. And this program is completely voluntary, so these actions you can take, you can choose to do them or not. It is really up to you. The more you do, the more it's going to help the lake. And if you even start the process and decide you don't want to take actions, you don't have to. And the program is open to all lake shoreline and upland landowners. So anybody that lives in that Sunday Lake watershed we showed earlier is eligible for the program. As I mentioned, it is a certification program, and in order to be certified, you complete what's called the Clear Choices checklist. The checklist is just a list of simple actions you see in front of you that you can take to reduce pollution at your lake. So the orange part on the top here is for any landowner, and if you complete all the actions in lawns and yards and septic systems, you receive a LakeWise certified sign as shown here in the upper right hand corner. These are actions like committing to avoid fertilizer, or if you do fertilize, using phosphorus-free products. It has other things like, for example, scooping your pet waste if you own a dog. And then in septic systems, you are required to have a septic system inspection in the past 3 years and commit to that for every 3 years, for example. So you can take a look at the checklist and see what those actions are further. If you live on a shoreline, for those of you that do, there is an optional Healthy Shore certification, and you obtain that by either committing to maintain your existing natural shoreline, or if you have lawn to that shoreline, if you replace some of that with other plants such as shrubs, perennials, and trees, you can receive an optional Healthy Shore certification. LakeWise kicks off an educational visit to your property. In this site visit, our watershed steward provides you with a packet of information that's been tailored to your property, and it's an opportunity for you to go over the checklist specific to your property and to ask any questions about things like natural yard care, plants that you may have in your property, or septic systems and how you might maintain those. It's completely voluntary, and you don't need to have anything completed on the checklist before you schedule a site visit. We also offer natural lawn care workshops, and these are typically held in the spring and again in the fall. Similarly, we also offer septic system care workshops. These are great workshops. Residents have found them to be really helpful, whether you're new to a septic system or have been an owner for years. In addition, you can receive a $200 rebate for attending those workshops, and that can be for inspecting a septic system or installing a riser. And because of the COVID situation, we actually are going to be moving these online this July. We're not sure of the dates yet, but they'll be coming soon. If you find yourself in a position where your septic system is failing, the county also has the Savvy Septic program that provides low-interest loans for septic system repair or replacement. There are also limited grant funds available to assist lower fixed income households. The last piece of our LakeWise program is our optional Healthy Shore certification. So plants along the shoreline are the last line of defense for the lake, and they can absorb, as I mentioned, 9 times more phosphorus than lawn. So shoreline landowners can choose to restore a portion of their shoreline and receive additional certification. We have lots of materials to assist you, including planting plans, a native planting guide, and we also offer free plants to those that are interested in restoring some shoreline. Sunday Lake has had a lot of landowners that have restored their shoreline, so this is just a few examples from that, so you can see what lake shoreline restoration looks like. So this is one property that you can see at the top, a before picture. The middle is a drain planting, and this, I think, is 1 year after the planting. Maybe that's 2 years after the planting. The Sunday Lake community property is another really good example of a shoreline restoration project. The top pictures were taken before, and the lower pictures are taken after of that community property. So Lakewise has had a lot of participants from across the county, and especially at Sunday Lake. Unfortunately, not very many people at Sunday Lake like to have their picture taken, so I only have a few pictures from Sunday Lake residents in here. But I did want to recognize that we have had 31 households in the Sunday Lake watershed participate in Lakewise, be either attending a workshop or having a site visit. Of those, 16 have had Lakewise site visits, and 11 have become fully certified, finishing everything on their checklist. In addition, it's pretty astounding, but 6 shoreline residents have restored and maintained their shoreline. So we've had a total of 550 feet or 0.15 acres of lake shoreline restored at Sunday Lake. So thank you all for your participation and congratulations, and we hope that even more of you can get involved in this program. If you're interested in signing up for the Lakewise program, please give us a call or send us an email and we'll set you up with a site visit. And we'll also be sending out those new online workshops. So we've talked about residential phosphorus control, which takes care of the runoff in the septic systems. But the big external phosphorus source that we obviously need to address in terms of the plan is waterfowl. So waterfowl is a bit of a tricky one. Swans, as well as Canada geese, are protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. So what this means is there's very limited options to control these populations. And swans especially are an interesting one because they're kind of a recovery success story. So back in the 1930s, they thought that only 69 trumpeter swans were alive in the United States at all. Later in the 60s, they found that there were about 2,000 that bred in Alaska. And so this is what comprised the Pacific Coast population. And this is the population that we see in Sunday Lake that's migrating. And since then, that population has increased dramatically. In 2000, they found that this population accounted for 74% of all the trumpeter swans in North America. And the most recent survey showed that the population is now up to about 26, almost 27,000. So Sunday Lake, it's got a lot of swans, but there's really not much that can be done about this in terms of inputs. There are some options, though, that can help limit waterfowl and things that we can do to protect that waterfowl. The first thing that we can do, and this especially works well with the Canada geese, so if you have problems with geese poop all over your lawn, there are some things you can do. So first of all, Canada geese really love lawns. It's a great place for them to feed, and they also really like to have clear lines of sight from predators. So if you have lawn all the way to your shoreline, it's a paradise for Canada geese. So one thing that you can do to be really effective is you can do shoreline plantings. So 30 inches of vegetation is what they need to not have that line of sight. So even if you let your grass grow really long by the shoreline, it can help reduce the number of geese that get up into your lawn. The wider the planting is, it works best. And again, through our Lakewise program, we have some planting guides where you can still have your views and access, but help deter those geese. There are other strategies people use for geese deterrence, or ducks if that's an issue in your property. Things like putting fences or all sorts of things. There's a link here that you can click on to go to. And Fish and Wildlife also in some cases has allowed communities to do egg addling is what they call it, where they shake the eggs. So if you have a geese population that's not leaving, it's overwintering, there are some options if a community wanted to do such a thing. The other big thing I don't want to go without saying is that there's never really a good reason to feed ducks and geese. It's really bad for both the health of the birds and the lake. So a couple things that can happen, especially if you're feeding ducks or geese white bread or other things, it leads to malnutrition, or it's called angel wing disease, where ducks and geese and swans, their babies or the young can't fly because their wings become deformed, because even though they're eating a lot, it's not giving them the nutrition they need compared to their natural vegetation sources. It also can lead to overcrowding, which increases disease, as well as swimmer's itch and bird die-offs. It decreases their natural behavior, and if you get a lot of ducks and geese, you're going to have pollution. The next phosphorus source that we need to control is what's called the internal phosphorus loading. And the major source of this, and traditionally how we think about it, is from the sediments. So from the sediments each year, you have any pollution that's gone into the lake and built up that's recycled back into the lake each summer. So in addition to that, in some ways we can view the waterfowl phosphorus as part of this internal loading, because as we know, we can't really prevent the waterfowl pollution from occurring. So in effect, the only way to deal with it is to reduce or neutralize it once it's already in the lake. The first method that we looked at for controlling internal phosphorus loading is dredging. Dredging is probably the most common lake restoration technique that residents at Sunday Lake have talked about when they've talked to us about things that we should consider. People are excited about it, partly because the lake also has become shallower or filling in over the years from the fragrant water lilies in particular. Unfortunately, when you look closer at dredging, it's a very difficult and expensive process. It's very difficult to get dredging permitted in a large open water body like Sunday Lake. And it's also extremely expensive, on the order of millions of dollars, because it takes specialized equipment, is logistically difficult, and then once you remove the sediment, you also have to dispose of it, which is very costly. Finally, even if you did dredge it, you would also need to do a follow-up treatment to the lake sediments to neutralize the phosphorus there, which would be an additional cost. So while dredging would have lots of benefits for the lake, we have rejected it as a suitable method for Sunday Lake. Aeration is another solution that's been brought up about a lot, especially because there are such a concern about oxygen problems in the lake. So aeration is something that could have beneficial effects. It adds oxygen to the bottom waters. We talked about before how phosphorus can be released from the lake sediments. If there is enough iron in the lake sediments and you aerate the lake, it can prevent that release. But we in our sediment study, we found that Sunday Lake just does not have enough iron to bind all the phosphorus, so that's not really a good solution. And in fact, because the aeration would physically disturb the lake bottom, it would actually probably increase phosphorus and algae blooms. So aeration on its own was also rejected. The second option we looked at for controlling the phosphorus in the lake is what's called an alum treatment. And an alum, you may have heard before, it's used in drinking water treatment, and it's used as a clarifier, meaning it clears out the water. And in lakes, what it does is it binds and neutralizes phosphorus in the water and the sediment. So it's kind of hard to see in this picture, but when it's applied, it basically forms a flock or a flocculant, and it kind of looks like snow. And as it sinks down through the water, it picks up and binds phosphorus in the water. And then as it descends into the sediment, it has a number of sites there where it can bind aluminum or phosphorus, and it ends up neutralizing phosphorus in the sediments as well. And so if you were to look down in water after an alum treatment, you would see kind of a layer of white, kind of flocculent material. The good thing about this treatment is that phosphorus, once it's bound to alum, it's a permanent bond, and so it can no longer be recycled from the sediment into the water each summer. So it's a permanent solution for taking care of that long-term pollution in the lake sediments. It's also the most widely used lake restoration technique in the world, and so there's been lots of studies and documentation to assess its effectiveness. And just so you know, if you are interested, we looked at several other types of products that can be used for treatment of phosphorus in the water as well. You can see more about those in the plan, but this is the only one that we found to have good levels of documented success. So the first question people are going to ask anytime you put a chemical into water is it safe? And alum is extremely safe in terms of human health and recreation. There are no restrictions on fishing, swimming, or lake recreation except right during the treatment, so nobody's actually hit by the boat. It's used frequently in drinking water treatment, and you can even buy it at the grocery store for pickling. There are some major risks to alum treatments, though, if not done properly. Alum is an acid, so it has a high potential to change the lake pH. So in smaller systems, it needs to be applied with a buffer to help prevent pH changes, and in this case, it's sodium aluminate. It can also cause gill irritation in fish because it does create that flocculent material. Most fish are completely unaffected by this, but we have found that it is not advised to treat during perch spawning season in May because they are highly sensitive at that time already. They're very prone to dying during spawning, so it's best to apply when they are not spawning. And so overall, it's really important that alum treatments are dosed and applied correctly to avoid these ecological impacts. So in order to figure out what an alum treatment would look like and cost, you need to figure out how much alum you would need. And so this is something that we were able to derive from the sediment study to start, is to figure how much alum would be needed to neutralize the phosphorus in the sediments. And in total we found that would be 58.1 milligrams of aluminum per liter. And I know these numbers aren't going to mean much, but in the next slides I'll put them in perspective with kind of the cost and what that looks like. We also had to figure out how much would be needed in the water column, and that's about 4.6 milligrams of aluminum per liter. So this is something at a total dose. If you wanted to neutralize every bit of phosphorus in Sunday Lake as of last summer, the dose would be about 62.7 milligrams of aluminum per liter. This will basically reset the lake back to a condition where there is no internal loading occurring each year and account for all of the pollution up to this point. But because there is ongoing pollution, it will need long-term maintenance as more pollution continues to flow into the lake. So if you're looking at doing an alum treatment in a lake, one option is to just apply all the alum at once. However, because of the extremely large dose at Sunday Lake and the very small size of the lake, that is definitely not an advisable treatment option. Instead, we explore looking at multi-year alum treatments. We're giving you one scenario, which we think is a reasonable scenario to work with in terms of what multi-year alum treatments might look like. But again, there are lots of options. The goal is basically just to treat the total dose over time. So what we proposed is in year one to do half of the total dose, or about 31.4 milligrams of aluminum per liter. This would take out a huge chunk of the alum or of the phosphorus in the lake sediments, as well as treat anything that was in the lake that year from the waterfowl or other sources. Then, so what that looks like and how much that is about 32,000 gallons of alum and about 16,000 gallons of sodium aluminate, or the buffer. So what does that actually look like? It's about 12 tanker truckloads of product going into the water. So it's, again, a big dose. And this would be typically done in early spring after most of the rains have occurred. So sometime in March is the optimal time to do such a treatment. Then we would recommend for several years, we estimated and did a plan for 10 years to spread out the rest of that treatment across the 10-year time period. And what this allows you to do is to not only continue to treat the phosphorus that's already in the sediments, but also treat all the new phosphorus coming in from the waterfowl and the homes and septic systems around the lake, etc., each year. So this is a really good type of treatment idea for Sunday Lake, because that way you're not only capturing all the old pollution, but the new stuff each year. And that would be estimated about 8 milligrams of alum per liter per year. So there's a lot of pros in the multi-year treatments. First of all, you'll see immediate improvement from that large treatment. It also allows you to have adaptive management. So like I mentioned at the beginning, some of our estimates for how much phosphorus loading is occurring are very certain and have really good ideas of how much to put in. So for example, the sediments, we were able to calculate very closely to what that alum dose should be. But the waterfowl, for example, can be highly variable from year to year, and our estimates are not perfect for how much phosphorus comes from that load. So if you continue monitoring the lake each year and how much phosphorus is there, you could adaptively manage for it in each of those subsequent treatments. So if it turns out the alum treatments are being really effective and there is less phosphorus in the lake than is expected, you can decrease your alum treatment and significantly decrease costs. And similarly, if you end up having more waterfowl or it's not as effective as you hoped, you can slightly increase that. And we have done this approach at local lakes and shown that these small doses can actually be quite effective, more so than originally thought. There are cons to this approach. There is money for mobilizing contractor overtime each year, and the cost of alum can change over time. The last technique we looked at, an option for lake restoration that we considered, was actually a combination of two of the ones we've already talked about, which is the combination of aeration and alum injection. So when we talked about alum before, it was being applied from a boat on an annual basis. But some lakes across the country have instead opted for a continuous alum injection system. So basically, you have a tank of alum on the shoreline, you have some pumps and pipes going into the lake, and you're continuously injecting alum when the lake is flowing or when the waterfowl are there, and you're neutralizing the phosphorus that's coming in over time, and also the phosphorus in the sediments. This can be coupled with aeration to increase its effectiveness. So aeration alone, we had a lot of issues, especially that it might cause more problems because phosphorus from the sediments will be released. But when combined with alum injection, it can help to spread the alum, as well as help with a lot of the dissolved oxygen problems the lake is seeking or experiencing. So for Sunday Lake, it would look like that we would need 3 hypolimnetic aerators in the lake. So these would be aerators installed in the bottom of the lake. You would have to have a small mechanical plant at the shoreline. So there would have to be some sort of easement or purchase, or in this case, perhaps the Sunday Lake Community Club would be willing to put it on their property. You would then need to have pipes anchored into the lake and electricity to that small plant. And it would require design, permitting, and construction, and it would also require annual maintenance and repair. So there are some cons for that, some pros to start with. You would have continuous treatment of the problem. You could really adaptively manage this. So you could fine tune what your dose needed to be based on what you're seeing each year. And again, you would get lots of oxygen benefits for fish. There are some cons though. There's a lot of high upfront costs. It will require annual maintenance and care from people. And the cost of alum can again change over time. So while we explored lots of alternatives, the 3 main alternatives that we are bringing forth for you to consider is, first of all, our Lakewise program, which is already existing, our multi-year alum treatment plan, or aeration and alum injection. So the question is, what can you expect from each of these options? So alternative or option 1 would be Lakewise only. So this plan or program is basically what we're doing right now, except there could be increased participation and commitment. Now, Lakewise does require long-term commitments from residents to implement. So not only do people have to participate originally, but then they need to continue to do good practices like have septic system inspections regularly. What you can expect in terms of how it will affect the water quality. So right now, the water quality in the lake is fairly stable. So the Lakewise program will help to slow the progression of the lake getting worse. So that 20 to 30% of phosphorus coming from the homes could either be reduced or at least prevented from getting larger if everybody or a significant member of the community prevented or started the Lakewise program. At that point, it will not help the phosphorus that's built up in the lake sediments. And we don't know when that phosphorus buildup in the lake sediments is going to get worse. We just know that there's so much buildup in there that there is a high likelihood that conditions could worsen and increase algae in the lake. So if you added on either alternative 2 or 3 to the Lakewise program, you can expect more results, but you will also have long-term financial commitment from residents. The results that you'll expect on the ground is you'll have a significantly less potential for algae blooms, and you'll see those results immediately from the lake. There'll be a less chance of toxic algae. There'll also be a clearer lake. It's possible you could get aquatic plants growing in the areas that are a little bit darker now, a little deeper into the lake, But overall, you would have very lowered amounts of algae, higher water clarity, and more oxygen. So if we look at the results or benefits in terms of what the water quality would look like, we can use the current water quality conditions as a baseline and see how it would change. So for water clarity, it's currently in a poor condition, denoted by the purple, and you can expect that to increase likely to good, assuming the water color doesn't darken anymore. For phosphorus, it would also be going from a poor condition to a good condition, and this would be the major benefit of the alum treatment, and the goal of it is to reduce that phosphorus to a good condition. And in the upper waters, the goal by the state is to be below 20 micrograms per liter. For algae, we would go from a poor condition to a good condition as well, so we could reduce the frequency of algae blooms in the lake. And for shorelines, it will really be largely unaffected, but this is really up to the lake community of whether it would go from a fair to a good condition, depending on if more people restored shorelines or not. So this is the slide that most of you are probably anxious to hear about, of how much does it cost. And I can start off with a tiny bit of good news in the fact that the first proposed element, Lakewise, is already funded by Snohomish County Surface Water Management. So it is subject to budgets each year, but this would be a free service available to the lake community. After that, the news does not look so good. So for element 2, we have alum treatments, and we'll talk about the option 1, the multi-year alum treatments first. So because of the very high amount of phosphorus pollution in the lake, it is quite expensive to conduct an alum treatment. It's estimated for our multi-year proposal, where we do a half of the full dose in year 1, that it would cost $325,000 for the treatment. For the maintenance treatments in years 2 through 9, it would be $90,000. In year 10, it would be $100,000. And that includes lake sediment monitoring in year 10 to see how effective the treatment was. This proposal also does include about $9,500 of year-round monitoring. For alum treatments, you have to do the monitoring to be able to assess how it's doing and figure out the dose for each year. That is something that could potentially be covered, a portion of it, by the existing volunteer monitoring program. So if we look about what that looks like per community member, we broke it down into one potential scenario of how these costs might be distributed. So in total, we found that there are 39 lake shoreline parcels, and we estimated that they would contribute about 80% of total costs. And there were 120 community parcels that have access to a lakefront property that would pay 20% of the costs. So what that looks like, you can see here in the table, the cost per lakefront parcel is quite high. So in year 1, that would be about $6,700, and almost $2,000 annually each year after that. Community parcels are much more affordable at $542 for the first year, and then down in the hundreds in years 2 through 10. The alum injection with whole lake aeration was the second potential option. There's a lot of uncertainty in the cost here because we did not do a full engineering and design analysis, because even the base level cost is quite low. So we gave you our best estimate here of what that looks like in terms of a range, and that does include installing, maintaining, and operating the alum injection system and aerators. It does not include the cost if additional property needs to be purchased to install that aeration. So unfortunately, these costs are very high and probably are cost prohibitive for being able to pursue these lake restoration options. So now that we've been able to understand the problem, researched and identified the best solutions and the costs associated with those, it's now time to choose a path forward. To determine the best path forward, community members will need to weigh the benefits of the plan with the cost for implementation. Snohomish County has provided draft recommendations to help guide the community for these options, but these are draft recommendations only. We are seeking your input to finalize these in the plan. The first recommendation is to continue to implement the Lakewise program. The more residents that participate in the Lakewise program, the more phosphorus pollution can be prevented from entering the lake. While this will not cause immediate health benefits in the lake, it will prevent conditions from worsening in the lake and therefore should be continued. The second recommendation is to delay the alum treatments. Alum treatments, as you saw, are extremely costly and will be a large cost burden for the residents. In addition, in the past few years, toxic algae blooms have actually decreased in occurrence. However, based on the study findings, there is a large and increasing buildup of pollution in the lake, and at some point in the future, this high pollution may cause conditions to significantly worsen. We recommend taking a wait-and-see approach until the conditions worsen, at which time residents can reevaluate the costs and benefits of implementing the alum treatments. The next recommendation is to continue volunteer monitoring. Volunteer monitoring is a service the county is currently providing and will help to identify further changes in lake health. It's also really important that citizens continue to report toxic algae blooms so people can be notified of the blooms and change their behavior as needed. One of the other key findings of the study was that the robust native plant population is really important to protecting the lake from worse phosphorus blooms. We think this is one of the reasons why Sunday Lake has not seen more severe blooms as other area lakes have seen with the same levels of phosphorus. These plants help to outcompete algae for phosphorus and prevent them from growing and getting worse blooms. And finally, we recommend continuing invasive lily control with caution. So the community has been started on lily control, and it's really important as that control continues to remove the lilies on an incremental basis. If you were to remove them all at once, you risk having significant impacts on dissolved oxygen and phosphorus release. Should the community decide to go forward and implement the plan now, the plan does provide funding options and potential next steps for the community to get started. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of funding opportunities available from the state or federal governments, but there is one, which is the Freshwater Algae Grant through the Department of Ecology. This is the same grant funding that paid for this plan. This provides for $50,000 in grant funding, which also on top of that requires a $12,500 match. There has been talk of potentially increasing this to a larger amount, but for now this is the current status. It does require a public entity to author and manage such a grant and would require the county approving it in order for us to be able to support this grant. The next main funding source is to have lake community residents pay for lake restoration. And this is probably the most common way that most lake work is funded across the state. There's a variety of ways to do this. The first is, and most informal, is a simple lake association collection. And this is basically where lake residents, either in a formal or informal lake association, collect funds in order to pay for that. And I believe this is how currently the lily restoration work is being paid for right now. The second is a bit more formal. It's a surface water management fee surcharge. So right now, all of you pay surface water management fees to pay for the lakes program is one example, as well as the management of all of our drainage networks, the ditches and the culverts throughout the county, as well as river flooding and other services that are paid for by surface water management fees. So what this is when a certain area or a portion of the county is specifically wanting to do some sort of work, they go to their county council member and they ask for an additional surcharge to be added to their surface water management fee. Now the surcharge is designated only for whatever that community is designating it for. So for example, Seven Lakes, Goodwin, and Shoecraft use this surcharge to do milfoil control. Lake Ketchum has used this tool to do and fund alum treatments. So if this is an option that the community is interested in, they would need support from both the community and the county to move forward on that. It is something that's part of a tax bill, so it's collected from everybody, but it does allow for exemptions for seniors, so that can provide some tax relief for those that may not be able to pay for it. Their last one is a lake management district, and this is a formal method of collecting lake funds where you set up a special fee district. It is very expensive to set up. Its process is outlined in the state code, so I'm not going to go into it a lot, but if this is something the community is interested in, there's a lot of information available on this option. So the question is what would be the next steps for the community should they actually want to go about implementation? And our recommendation, based on what has worked well at other lakes, is for the community to create a committee to explore and figure out what the next steps would look like. So this committee could be a subset of one of the existing committees, either the Lily Control Group or the Sunday Lake Community Club. You would first probably want to develop a structure of some sort if you're going to be collecting funds or use an existing structure. You'd have to decide what type of funding you wanted to go to. There would need to be strong communication with other residents to make sure everybody was on the same page of what those steps would look like, and that community would be able to do the coordination with Snohomish County. Congratulations, you've now finished the presentation. But what we're really interested in knowing is your feedback. This is ultimately the Sunday Lake Community Group's plan, and so we need your input to be able to finalize it. Please go to the survey below and take it. It should take no more than a few minutes, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you again to everybody. We wish we were seeing you in person, but we are here for you still. If you have any questions or want to discuss the plan, please give us a call at the number below or send us an email. Thank you.